Hi guys, so has been a long time since I've done this kind of educational video with a whiteboard. Um, do provide your support, like liking the page, subscribing to the page, and even buy things from me because I don't get paid for this kind of charity. But anyway, today's topic is gonna be the myth that surrounds FOC. FOC stands for front of center. Sometimes you also call it forward of center, doesn't matter. But basically what it really says is the position of the center of mass or the center of gravity of the arrow relative to the arrow length, specifically the center of the arrow. So for example, in this case, this arrow right here, this is the approximate pivot point, right? The pivot point, the center of mass or center of gravity is about here. And this is where the center of the arrow is located. So this distance here is the forward of center or front of center. I don't know how much percentage this is relative to the arrow. I'm just going to give a rough estimate based on just eyeballing from the camera here. That looks like, I don't know, almost 20%. Almost 20%. So, okay, so that percentage is just basically how forward that center of mass is relative to the arrow. That's all. That's what it means. So if you want to have more detailed explanation of what that is, Google it. All right, you can find how to calculate that, but that's not the topic here. We are talking about the myth and the things that actually makes more interesting to talk about than the actual calculation. So there's a very popular belief, right? Very popular belief among arrow sellers that the FOC is some sort of magic number for the best performance of the arrow that he sells. He can quote, I'm just giving like random numbers, all right? They can quote that, okay, for these arrows, 10% FOC is the best performance. Or maybe another seller will say 20% is the best performance, and so on, blah, blah, blah. So what is true about it? I can tell you this. This magic number is bullshit. For what matters, okay, for practical things that you can see when you use them, except for certain exception, which I will cover in the video, most of the time, these kind of claims are just bullshit. Okay, bullshit. So there's also another claim that a high front of center leads to nose diving. Okay, I think this is very popular among a lot of people. I'm sure you've heard of it, that a higher front of center causes the arrow to nosedive. And I can also tell you, if you're lazy to watch the entire video, that is also bullshit. Another claim, a low front of center increases the range of the arrow, because with a higher front of center, it causes nose diving, so a lower front of center makes the arrow travel flatter and further. No, that's bullshit. There is a very specific situation in which it will actually work. I'm gonna cover that later in the video, but for the most purpose, for the most situation, that is bullshit. Okay, so lastly, a high front of center improves stability, forgiveness, and the penetration of the arrow. This is a fact and has been proven by a lot of people. So what do I mean by stability, forgiveness, and penetration? All right, so stability, basically when the arrow flies and there is some sort of stability and forgiveness is kind of related. Stability basically refers to the like wobbleness, fishtailing, and all this kind of movement of the arrow. So a stable arrow just flies through the air clean. It just goes zip through the arrow without all this extra motion. And forgiveness refers to how fast the arrow can recover from this kind of disturbance. So, like for example, our release may not be perfect. So when we make mistakes, the an arrow that is forgiving, it will stabilize that kind of wobbliness very quickly and return to a stable flight. Or maybe, for example, if you're in a hunting situation, maybe 3D archery, and your arrow somehow glance a leaf or something, so that causes, it initiates a wobble in the arrow, right? And a forgiving arrow will recover from that kind of wobble very quickly and return to a stable flight. And if you are a hunter, you'll probably be interested with arrow penetration into the target. So a high front of center will indeed lead to higher penetration. And if you're interested to know more about arrow penetration, no, this video don't really cover that. But you can research. You can just search for Dr. Ashby, ASHBY, Dr. Ashby's report. He did a lot of experiment on that, and he recommends very high front of center, like 30%. Pretty crazy. It's difficult to achieve that high amount, but it's not unachievable. It's just difficult to achieve. All right. So, with that said, now I'm gonna go through the ideal front of center for a target and hunting situation. Now, why do I have to be very specific here? Is because for flight archery, this is not true. Okay, for flight archery. So for most of us, you and me, most likely we are doing either target archery, and some of them will be doing hunting. So in those cases, which is the most of cases, what will be the ideal front of center? Now, this cannot actually happen in real life, all right? This cannot happen in real life because the ideal arrow will have its weight, everything in the tip. Everything, the entire weight of the arrow is at the tip. And it has a weightless but stiff shaft, right? So you see where it couldn't happen, right? Because it requires that this arrow gives you sufficient stiffness for your setup, but it has to have zero mass. All the mass is concentrated only in the front. In such a case, if you have such thing, which cannot happen again, it cannot happen, but if you have such an ideal imaginary arrow, then you only require very minimal fletching. Why is that? Since the shaft is literally weightless, you have the entire mass of the arrow here. All right? If this is center, you have the entire mass of the arrow here. That's 50% front of center. It makes sense, right? Because 50% is half of the arrow length, and if you count 50% of front of center from the middle, that's exactly where the point is. So a 50% front of center is unachievable, but would be the ideal imaginary arrow. With such a high front of center, all the mass, everything here, you have a very long leverage from the fletching to stabilize this arrow. As a result, you need very minimal fletching to stabilize this arrow in flight. Any disturbance, you deflect the arrow, it returns back almost instantly because there's so much leverage, there's so much advantage for the fletch. Even just a little bit is enough. So as a result, you have very minimal fletching, you have very little drag on the arrow, and it's very stable, very forgiving. Okay, that would be the ideal target or hunting arrow. Okay, although it cannot actually happen. Remember that? This is just imaginary, okay? Because I do not want people coming, no, this cannot happen. Of course it cannot happen. This is just, imaginary. Alright, so such an arrow provides the maximum stability and forgiveness. Alright. Now, what about in terms of penetration and recovery? Like the flight recovery. So, I want you to imagine now this arrow is flying and it hits something really hard. A hard impact on let's say the bone of an animal. What's going to happen? Upon a hard impact, this arrow is going to flex. all right, it's gonna flex because this arrow it can't just suddenly stop. It can't just stop. It would kind of push forward, right? The back is gonna push forward, and usually your arrow is never 100% straight and 100% stiff. There is flexibility in the arrow. That's why the spine. And since it's not 100% straight, there is some sort of a curve, although it's very, very minimal and we can't see it. It's maybe in microns. So as this push forward and there's some unstraightness or bend that you cannot see, it would flex, it would bend, right? This bending, depending on how your shaft is made, like for example, a barreled shaft, tapered shaft, and so on, upon a hard impact, the bending is going to occur approximately, okay? I cannot give you an exact number because it depends on many things. Like, for example, how deep the tank of the arrow is. There's a lot of factors, right? So the bending is going to occur between 1/3 to about 1/2 of the arrow. And this is the critical bending part. Anything past that is actually energy wasted, okay? Energy wasted. Because to bend something, okay, it takes energy. Just like when you pull a bow, when you bend the limbs, it takes energy, all right? It takes away energy from you. So in this case, when it bends, it takes away energy from the back half of the arrow, or maybe even back 1/3, back 2/3 of the arrow. So upon bending, the energy past that bending point, they are all actually wasted. They are stored into the shaft as a potential energy. And then as it flexes back, it straightens, it transfers the energy back towards the other side. So sometimes you get arrow bouncing back from the target. That's exactly what happened. So upon impact, it bends, and then as it straightens, it pushes there, and it goes back towards you. So that's what happens when an arrow bounces back. Okay, those are energy lost. So if you have a weightless back or a minimum weight in the back, you are losing a lot less energy. All the energy will be stored in front, which is not related, right? It's before the bending point. So when you have less of the energy lost, you get better penetration. And also, of course, when the arrow is flying and it hits something, right, that deflects the arrow and it causes instability. So the recovery is very quick because now the less mass here, the less work the fletch has to do to get it back to a stable path. So again, the ideal front of center is an arrow such that the entire weight of the arrow is at a point, and then everything here is weightless with a very minimal fletching. That would be ideal. But it cannot happen, okay? So in reality, we will always get less than 50% front of center because the shaft has weight, okay? As simple as that, the shaft has weight. And depending on the material, because some material are dense but not strong, in that case, you need very thick, a lot of material to get the same stiffness. There are material like carbon that is very, very strong and very light. So in that case, you have a stiff shaft for a very low weight. If you have the first material I mentioned, something that is not very strong and very heavy, you will end up with a low front of center. No matter how much front of center you try to push, you will end up with low numbers. And that's why wood arrows, aluminum arrows, they tend to give you lower number, like 10%. Okay, not exact, because it depends on your setup. But I'm just giving you a rough common figure, about 10%. If you have carbon arrows, because the shaft is lighter, it's easy to push it further out, like 15-20%. It's easy. You can always push further, depends on what you're trying to do. But just keep this in mind that there is no such thing as FOC that is too high. There is no such thing. There is no your front of center is too high. No such thing. The higher, the better. As simple as that. You want to get as high as possible while keeping the arrow weight suitable for your bow. That's all. So if you have the option to have two different arrows, and both of them, of course, is going to be the same final weight for your setup, pick the higher front of center. It will fly better. As simple as that. And that's why usually people say that the carbon arrow flies better than the aluminum arrow, than the wood arrow, because it has a higher front of center. As simple as that. It's very simple. Alright? No front of center is too high. You will never reach 50%, but you get as high as you can while keeping the weight that is suitable for your bow. So, just now I mentioned a lot of bullshit, right? There's a lot of bullshit that's popular belief. So why do these bullshit exist? It actually comes down to barrel arrows. So why am I blaming barrel arrows, right? Okay. So I'm not saying barrel arrows are bad. That's not what I meant. What I mean is the barrel arrow is actually often misunderstood. You see, when you bend the arrow, right, the spine of the arrow, you bend the arrow. Remember I mentioned that the bending is always approximately 1/3 to one half of the arrow, which is here, right? Okay, this is a very ugly drawing, I know. I tried to draw something nicer, but it's so difficult to draw, so I drew something very ugly. Alright, so this ugly barrel arrow here has its fat part in the center of the arrow, where it flexes the most. Alright, so you have most material in the part that flexes the most. And towards these two ends, they don't flex as much. So you don't really need as much material. You can shave most of them off. Okay, make them smaller, cut the weight down, and you can still get the same spine stiffness. Therefore, a barrel shape provides the lowest shaft weight, for the same stiffness. Okay, I believe nobody's gonna argue about this. That's exactly the advantage of the barrel arrow. Now, this is where a lot of people don't understand. You see all this weight that you save just now, that you shave off from there? What if you, for every gram that you save here, right, here, you put it into the point, and every weight you save here, you also put it to the point. Now you have the same weight as what you started with, but you have a higher front of center because you're moving material from here to the tip. You're also moving material here to the tip. So barrel arrow, unlike popular belief, a lot of people thought, oh, you have most of the mass in the middle, therefore the center of gravity must be nearer to the center. Meaning the front of center is actually nearer to 0%. It brings it towards the center instead of from the point. And that is not true, because you want to shoot the same weight arrow, right? You shoot the same weight arrow, but when you convert to a barrel arrow, you're still shooting the same weight arrow, but now you move all this material forward and you actually achieve a higher front of center for the same weight arrow. So now you get all these benefits. In a barrel arrow, you actually get higher front of center, not lower. Alright, so of course, you don't just get higher front of center. This is not the only case possible. You can also use this for another situation where you shave off the weight, but you don't add them back to the point. Okay, that's the case for flight archery. So in the case of flight archery, this shape here provides a lower drag coefficient, because if you are not aware of this, just search for aerodynamic or hydrodynamic and things like that. So the barrel arrow being this shape is actually to make it more aerodynamic, reduce the drag coefficient so that you have less energy lost as it flies downrange. It's mainly because of this part here. As it becomes thinner, there's actually less skin friction, air rubbing against the surface of the arrow on this part. So there's going to be reduced skin friction, especially for a very long object like an arrow, So if you have like a tapering towards the end, there's a lot less friction here. So it improves the aerodynamic of the arrow, making the arrow fly further. And of course, if you're doing flight archery, that is exactly what you want. Okay, so aerodynamic is more important for a lightweight and high velocity arrow shooting longer distance. If you have a heavy arrow, right, this aerodynamic thing don't really matter that much, because heavy arrow usually comes with a lower speed. So heavy arrow and lower speed, this aerodynamic thing don't really affect the arrow all that much. And furthermore, you're shooting at a shorter distance target. It only really matters if you're doing flight archery. Okay, this barrel thing is flight archery. For target archery, for hunting, there's really not too much advantage to the barrel shape. So now that brings us to the other part. So this one I was talking about the barrel arrow giving us the wrong perception of the front of center, right? It actually achieves higher front of center with this setup, but a lot of people think it achieves a lower front of center. So another one, this is so popular, super popular. So a lot of people, they conduct tests and make the wrong conclusion. So why? Because they are doing a very poor test and experiment. Okay, what are they? Let me give you some examples that I believe you have heard before, and you probably might have considered doing them as well. So some people may just use the same shaft, same arrow, right? Then they say, oh, I didn't change the knot, I didn't change the fletching, I didn't change the shaft. Same arrow. And I'm just gonna use from a smaller point to a bigger point to adjust different point weight, which gives me different front of center. Okay? When you do that, they found out that, oh, the biggest arrowhead, the heaviest one, which gives you the highest front of center, the arrow is a lot slower and plunges, nose dives. So they concluded that the high front of center is bad, it nose dives. But do you see the problem? When you use a bigger point, you are increasing the arrow weight. It is the arrow weight that is slowing down the arrow. It is not the front of center, it is the arrow weight. The nosedive is caused by a heavier and slower arrow, not the front of center. So that is a really, really flawed experiment, and it's very common. A lot of people do this kind of test and concluded that the arrow nosedives when you use a bigger, heavier point. Of course, it is heavier. It has nothing to do with the front of center. So I've seen someone else doing a much better experiment. I cannot remember the video, but I've seen it before. So what he did is that, again, same nock, same fletch, same shaft, and he considered about the arrow weight. So what he did is that he wanted to maintain the same arrow weight throughout all his arrows that he's testing. So how does he adjust the front of center? Is by having a rear compensated weight. So for example, let's say he start off with let's say a 300 grain point, all right, and there's nothing at the back. So the other arrow that's going to test, let's say he's going to use a 200 grain point, but now the extra 100 grain he's going to add into the back here. So that way the total is still a 300 grain combination, right? And that's how you achieve the same arrow weight throughout all your arrows, but have different front of center. The result of his test shows that there is a negligible difference between a high front of center versus a low front of center. I can't remember exactly how many percent. I think it was somewhere close to 20% down to 0%. I think something like that. I don't remember the exact amount. But the test, he tested out to a very long distance, which is something like 90 yards. That would give me something like, I believe, 81 meters. So that's a reasonable amount of distance for target archery and hunting application. So there is a negligible difference in his observation, although it does seem that sometimes the high front of center would land a bit lower, sometimes lands a bit higher. That's human error. But from my observation of his video, I can still see that at longer distance, it comes down a little bit. The higher front of center does come down a little bit more. So what is going on? You see, just now I mentioned that he used a different point. All right, he used a different point, but he compensated for the weight and the back. So what actually happens? Now imagine this two arrow here. Just assume the shaft is the same, right? Everything else is the same except for a different point. Now, the bigger, heavier point actually has more surface area. Not only that, it has a higher drag coefficient because a bigger point will have to push more air out of the way. So what he is unintentionally adding to the setup is the drag. He didn't account for the drag of the point. So that is why there is a very negligible difference, and it was only observable at very, very, very long distance. So let's see. The correct way to test, okay, the correct way to test is to have, okay, ignore this one, I'm just trying to show, let me put this one down. You want to have the same nock, same fletch, same shaft, and then what you're gonna do, you want to have also the same exact point, okay, same exact point, because you want the external, the outside, to be exactly the same so that you have the same drag and same friction. And you adjust the weight of the front of center, you adjust the weight by having a piece of metal inside which you can shift at different location. Of course, you have to glue it down. It's a bit difficult to do, but if you have the kind of time, you can try. You can definitely try. You can adjust that weight, all right, to get different front of center while keeping everything else outside the same. If you do the test correctly, as I just said, what you find is that there is no difference in the trajectory of the arrow for the front of center beyond a certain point. You see, I phrased this one to be very exact, okay? Once the front of center is beyond a certain point, it does not have any influence in the trajectory, alright? So of course, I have reason, and I'm going to explain below. But what you will find in the test, if you conduct that, is that eventually you want to move that piece of metal all the way to the tip, and that gives you the best stability and forgiveness on the arrow. And you still have the same trajectory. So that comes down to the topic. So why the front of center does not influence the trajectory beyond a certain point. So for you to understand this, we have to first consider an ideal environment. Imagine Earth is a vacuum. Okay, there is no air. It's a vacuum. In a vacuum environment, okay. Now I didn't do this, right? I didn't create this formula. So if you want to know how they come up with this formula, you can search it. Okay, search it. I'm not gonna go through that. Alright. So in such an ideal vacuum environment, if you were to shoot your bow, your arrow, at a 45 degree angle to the ground, you will get the maximum distance that the arrow can travel. And the distance is given by the formula velocity squared divided by the gravitational constant. Okay, gravitational constant. So if your gravity is stronger, the distance is shorter. Makes sense, right? So if the gravity is weaker, then the distance increases. And this distance, since we are on Earth, our gravity is approximately the same. There is a little bit difference between the then what's it called? The equator to versus the two poles, because they are actually closer to the center of the Earth, because it's not exactly a round, right? It's a sphere. So there is some differences depending on where you are on Earth, but for most cases, you can assume that the gravitational constant is the same. So in that case, the maximum distance traveled by the arrow is dictated only by the arrow speed. Only by the arrow speed. The shape of the arrow doesn't matter. The front of center of the arrow doesn't matter. It could be a ball, it could be a whatever sphere, or I don't know, golf ball, or an arrow without flash or whatever, or even an arrow that is shot in reverse the other way, flying that way, right? It doesn't matter. If air is not existing, right? You don't have air in an ideal vacuum environment. All this shit I'm talking about, they're gonna fly the exact same distance if they have the same initial velocity. As simple as that. It is only determined by the initial launch velocity squared divided by gravitational constant. That's the maximum distance it can go. But we have to talk about reality, right? We have to talk about reality. So in reality, there is air drag, there is friction. And that's why your arrow cannot reach that distance that you desire. Even though that's what you calculated, you won't reach that. In fact, the optimum angle is going to be under 45 degrees. Of course, I don't know the exact degree. You have to ask experienced flight archers. They will give you a much better and correct angle. I asked Alan Case about the angle, and it depends on the wind condition. So some wind condition, you want to shoot it at something like 38 degrees. In other condition, you want to shoot it something close to like 43, 44 degrees. There's a lot of factors, so I'm not a flight archer. You ask the professional. I'm just telling the principle behind them, right? So, since in reality we have drag, we have friction, if we remove unpredictable environmental factor such as the wind, because the wind is a big external factor. You can have everything the same, but if the wind is blowing one side or the other, there's a lot of things that changes. So for this argument's sake of this whatever thing that's going on here, we have to assume we have no wind. Okay, we have no external factor. Without external factor, the drag and the friction of the arrow as it flies through the air would be the main factor, right? Because without air, they will all have the same exact trajectory. With air, then the only thing that is affecting the arrow is drag and friction, if wind is not playing a role. So it actually brings down the entire argument down to a very simple question. In the absence of external factor, does the front of center affect the drag and friction of the arrow? Right? I want you to think about it. Thus, the front of center of an arrow affect the drag and friction of the arrow. And here is my argument about it, all right, or hypothesis. Depends on how you look at it, right? So this is what I'm going to tell you. As long as the front of center that you have gives you enough leverage for the fletch to stabilize the arrow in its path, then the drag and friction of the arrow is unaffected. Now, what do I really mean by this? So we have a very simple arrow diagram here. This is the point, that's the fletch, right? And this one marks the center of the arrow. So this here is what the front of center means, right? The front of center is a shift from the middle to where the center of gravity or center of mass is. And I put this thing here as a fulcrum to kind of balance the arrow, okay? So that you understand. That is the balancing point. All right. CG stands for center of gravity or the center of mass. Both of these are the same. Now, there is drag on the front of the arrow because there's a point, and then there's friction from the shaft of the arrow, and then there's also drag and friction from the fletch. Okay? There is gonna be a point somewhere between these two where we call the center of pressure. That's where the net force interaction or drag between the front and the back. But because we have more drag caused by the feathers, the center of pressure is actually more towards the back. Okay? You understand that, right? So because there is more drag and friction from the fletch compared to the point that's nice and clean, the center of pressure is more to the back. Okay, the center of all this drag and things going on. Because this is not the only one that has drag. The front also has drag, it just has less than this. So upon balancing these two, it has to be somewhere here, maybe here. Alright, just giving a rough estimate. So you just understand the idea. There's drag here, there's drag there, but there's more there. So the drag is biased towards that side. That's what I call the center of pressure. So the distance between the center of pressure and the center of gravity, that's what I call the leverage. As long as you have a healthy amount of leverage here, your feathers here can stabilize your arrow effectively. And as long as the fletching is doing its job, aided by the leverage that it has to stabilize the arrow, as long as it does its job, your arrow is always pointing into the wind or into the air that is going through, right? Towards the path, right? So it goes into the air. So from the air's perspective, all you see is just the point, only the point, and of course the feathers sticking out. Then your drag is unaffected because the drag is related to what it sees from the front. If it's always pointing into the direction of the air, then the drag is unaffected. Same with the friction. The friction is how much surface is exposed to the air and rubbing against the air. So drag and friction will not be affected for as long as you keep the arrow in pointing towards the air at all times. So if you have enough leverage, your fletch will do its job and your arrow will be pointing towards the air at all times. As a result, drag and friction is not affected, so the front of center does not affect the trajectory as long as there's enough leverage to keep the drag and friction unaffected. Okay, so of course that comes another question. You see, it only does not affect drag and friction if there is enough leverage. So what happens if there is insufficient leverage? Like, what if you have very little fletching and your center of pressure is very close to the center of gravity, and let's say you have a very light point, so your center of gravity is also very close to your center of pressure, so your leverage is very small. What's going to happen? That brings us to the situation that I've been constantly giving an exception case, right? I've been constantly giving the exception case, and that applies to exactly what I'm talking here for flight archery. But as long as you have a reasonable leverage, which you need in target arrows and hunting arrows, your target arrow is gonna have like what, 10% FOC and above. If you have hunting arrows, you want even higher, like 15-20%, right? So if you have anything that is like, I don't know, 10% onwards, you have a very, very healthy amount of front of center, and so it will not affect your trajectory. No matter how high the front of center goes, it will not affect the trajectory. Okay, so now let's go to the flight archery case. Okay, I noticed that the video is getting really long, so I'm gonna try my best to move along quicker. So just now I was talking about the flight archery, right? Flight archery, and the role of the front of center in flight archery. So over here, I just depict the situation of shooting a flight arrow. Initially, you launch it, at some point, you reach the peak of its curve, the trajectory's curve, and then it comes back down to earth and lands somewhere, right? So in the case of flight arrows, they actually want to make the arrow as light as possible. They will have like super tiny and small but very aerodynamic point, barrel. Like this is, the front part is usually very, very aggressive tapering, so that you have very low mass in the front, and then there is less aggressive towards the back. There's tapering but less aggressive. So there's more material towards the back, which result in a the center of gravity, or the front of center, is actually negative. It's behind the center. It's negative, and they have like very small, tiny, cute fletches for flight archery. So what is happening throughout the flight? Okay. Initially, when you launch the arrow, it has the maximum speed. Okay, because you have very, very lightweight arrow and very powerful bow, you launch these flight arrows at like crazy high speed. So the thing that I didn't mention earlier is that the center of pressure actually varies with the velocity of the arrow. Velocity is speed, but velocity has direction. Okay, so I use them interchangeably here. Okay, it doesn't really matter. So initially, when you launch the arrow, because it has a very high speed, there will be very high drag onto the feathers. Okay, because the drag is related to the velocity squared. So at a high speed, when you launch the arrow, the feather, even though it's very tiny, very cute, they will do a better job. And therefore, the center of pressure is more towards the rear, is behind the negative front of center. Okay, front of center is already negative, it's behind the middle of the arrow. Okay, but the center of pressure is even further back. However, the leverage here is not much. It's small. There's only a small amount of leverage. Because of this small leverage, flight arrows are also quite sensitive to bad release. So they won't be as forgiving as target arrows or hunting arrows. And this is why you need actually really good skill with the release, especially to shoot a flight arrow. Otherwise, with such a low leverage, the arrow is gonna go crazy the moment you give it a bad release. Okay, so once you launch this one, because of it has some leverage, even though it's small, it will be stable initially. Okay, it will be stable because in the end you still have leverage. You have leverage, and the arrow will recover, although it may not be as good as a target or hunting arrow. It will recover and take a stable path of trajectory. It's gonna fly stable initially, but this is where the magic happens. At its peak, the peak of the trajectory, the speed of the arrow is at its lowest. Okay, because this is where the maximum energy was initially, right? The moment you launch, it has the maximum energy, and as it goes through the air, it loses some of that to the friction, air friction and drag. Also, it gains in height. As it gains in height, it will lose some speed and convert that speed into potential energy, which as it comes down, it will regain the speed. Okay, so at this point here, the arrow has the lowest speed or the lowest velocity, and because it has the lowest speed at this point, those cute feathers are not doing a good job. Okay, they won't do a good job. When they don't do a good job because of the reduced velocity, what happens now? The center of pressure shifts forward. Okay, so initially they were doing better job, there's more drag, so the center of pressure is more to the rear, but when the speed is slower, the feathers aren't doing a good job, and so the center of pressure shifts forward. And they are the arrows are made such that the center of gravity is actually really, really close to the center of pressure at this peak point here. So, because they are very close to each other, there's almost no leverage. Almost no leverage. As a result, the arrow is actually very unstable at this point. Okay, unstable. The arrow cannot correct itself. If let's say the wind blows it sideways or whatever, that arrow will fly in that way. Or if it tumbles, it will fly in this way. It cannot correct itself because there is almost no leverage. Therefore, Alan Case, I asked him, and he pointed out that the center of pressure is not constant. Okay, it's not a constant position, it changes with speed. And that's how I realized about this one. So, at this point where it's unstable, the arrow relies heavily on the spin. Alright, that's what Alan told me. You have to make the arrow spin. The arrow must spin in flight. Because at this point where it's unstable, it relies on this spin to keep the arrow heading in the same direction. Alright, the gyroscopic effect. So you want the arrow to somehow at least don't tumble all around. Okay, so you want to spin and keep that trajectory as it comes down. Okay, so this is where the magic, even though it's not significant, but in flat archery, every centimeters count. Every centimeter counts. So that makes some difference. So what's going on? Because there is no leverage, okay, as it falls off the sky, it doesn't fall this way. Because the feathers couldn't stabilize the arrow, it will actually fall like this. So it is exposing the belly, the lower side of the arrow, okay, towards the path of the air. It falls like this, where the entire section down here is exposed. It's kind of like when you jump off the parachutes, right? Jump off the plane in skydiving. You want to like kind of open yourself up towards the trajectory of the fall. So that's what exactly is happening. The arrow is like face flat towards the fall direction. And because it's doing that, there's a lot of drag and friction here. And that is what keeps the arrow not exactly floating, but falls at a slower pace than had it corrected and stabilized. Okay, but it's only for a brief moment. So as it falls and it has no leverage on itself, okay, there's no leverage here, so it falls like that and it buys itself time so that it can travel a little bit further. Because as it falls, remember that there's actually still a forward velocity to the arrow, right? As it goes up like that, it is still moving here. It's still moving here. So even though it's falling this way, it is still moving forward. So every second, every millisecond that it can buy itself falling this way, it is still moving forward, and that's how it travels further in the case of flight archery. But eventually, as it falls, it starts to gain speed. Okay, it will regain the speed that I told you earlier. At this point, it loses speed because it converts to potential energy, and as it comes back down, it regains that speed. Okay, so as it regains speed, the center of pressure starts to move back. It starts to shift back again and regain some of the leverage. Then the arrow starts to point down again, because now it regains some leverage. The feathers can start working again, and it stabilizes, the arrow points down. Until eventually, when it lands, just before it hits the ground, it has I would say the maximum speed. This is where the maximum speed is. This is the second highest speed, because it has already lost some of that speed, some of the energy due to all the friction that's going on. So it won't be the highest, but from here on, that's exactly the highest speed just before it lands down again. At that point, we have the maximum speed with the exception of this side, and you get, again, there's leverage here. So when it lands, it will land this way, okay, head first, and not like that. It doesn't land this way. It lands head first because it regains its leverage again. So what does this say? As long as you have enough leverage, as long as the front of center that you have gives you enough leverage to stabilize the arrow, the front of center will not actually affect your drag and friction, and so it won't affect the trajectory. But if you have a front of center that is far back enough to the point it meets the center of pressure, then yes, it will actually make a difference. Especially in the case of flight archery, that's exactly what you want. It's intentional. Once this happens, where you have no leverage, you buy yourself some time, and so you actually do gain some advantage. You get further, you get a longer range, you get a slightly flatter, further trajectory.